Hi everybody, it's great to be back here again tomorrow. It's Friday, and here we are in my backyard with the noises of wind and someone's car alarm going off. But anyway, I love the ambience over here. Let's get our Torah lesson out. This week's lesson is in memory of my father, who this coming Monday is a year since his passing. Let's get right down to our Torah lesson. This week's portion, and more before we get to it, I want to bring down the words of the Rokeach. He was one of the middle-aged rabbis, the sages, Rabbi Eliezer Mevormaiza, Rabbi Eliezer from Worms, and I saw a beautiful Torah of Rav Baruch Rosenblatt, who brings us down, a beautiful Torah. If we look in the beginning of Genesis, you count 70 verses, you're going to come to the verse which talks about the snake being cursed. After 70 verses, and I'm not going to have time now to count every verse out with you, but you'll see, count it, you'll see, it says, God says to the snake, you will be cursed because of what you did. After 70 verses, very interesting. If you go to the Megillat Esther, the Megillah of Esther, of Queen Esther, and when Achashverosh begins to raise up Haman, the evil Haman, if you count 70 verses from that, you will also reach the hanging of Haman, which means after 70 verses he's hung. After 70 verses, the snake is also hung. So there's a connection between the two. But even more so, the Talmud says, if you want to find the name of Haman in the Torah, where do you go to? You go to the book of Genesis, where it says, when God says to the first, man, where are you? And he goes, and he says, well, he was hiding because he was naked. And God says, wait a second, Hamin ha'etz, from the tree that I told you not to eat from, you ate from. Hamin, in Hebrew means from. It also is the same letters, Hey, Mem, Nun, the same letters as Haman. So Haman is already reflected to in the tree of the snake that caused the sin of the first man. So it's all there. The first man, sin is of course blamed for, the reason behind it was the snake, the evil force, and that's connected to Haman, and those evil forces connect. So we see, wow, the beginning of the Torah, Haman and the snake are connected. But what does it have to do with this week's portion? Well, it's very interesting. This week's portion is a portion that deals with the holidays of the week, of the year, and it gives a list of all the holidays, starting with Passover and going on. It's very interesting that after the holidays are mentioned, the Rokeach asked the question, there are two holidays from the rabbis, the holiday of Purim and Chanukah. And maybe we can find some hints in this week's portion of Emor, and the answer is yes. Right after we read all about the holidays, what pops up? God commanding us, we're bringing the olive oil for the candle, labra in the temple, the menorah in the temple. This olive oil reflects, so obviously you don't have to look far to say that's Chanukah, standing right out in our faces. Right after that, what's the next thing brought down? The lechem panim, the showbread. The showbread refers to the bread of the meal. We know on Purim we have to have a banquet, we have to have a Sudat Purim, the whole great thing of celebrating a Sudan Purim, and that's reflected within the showbread. So therefore we have hinted to Chanukah and Purim. But even after that talks about the terrible incident of someone cursing God, and that the Rokeach says is Haman. It's related to the evilness of Haman of cursing Hashem. So here we see that not only we began it from the beginning of the Torah, we talk about Haman and this snake, but it's Purim is hinted here in this week's portion, so we could talk about Purim today a little bit, because it's hinted to in this week's portion. But let's go a step further over here. Why is it hinted in this week's portion? What's it all about? Well, the Omer sacrifice, which is really a very central part of this week's portion, because we talk about the holidays and talks about Pesach and then counting the Omer until Shavuot, and the center is right in the center of this week's portion is the Omer sacrifice. What happened on the day of bringing the Omer? Well, if we think about it, we go to the Torah, we see that when the cities of Sodom and Amorah were turned over, and it actually took place on the day of bringing the Omer sacrifice. So really, the day of the evilness of Sodom and Amorah it happened on the day of bringing this Omer sacrifice. And not only that, the word in Hebrew, HaOmer, is the same letters as Amorah in Hebrew. So it's really hinting that that's a day of eliminating and beginning the destruction of evil. It took place in that day, which is amazing. Not only that, the Rokeach brings down that the day that Haman, after 70 days, and Haman was eliminated on the tree, and they hung him up on the tree, that day also was the day of the Omer sacrifice. So that really, something connected to the Omer that really causes the downfall of evil. And why is that? What is that all about? So, the Talmud brings a story in the tractate of Megillah that Haman, he's coming after he was told by Achashverosh to go take Mordechai and put him on the horse and bring him around the city and etc. etc. Do all that. So he comes to the Beit Midrash. He comes to a school of Torah study, and Mordechai is teaching Torah to children. And Mordechai right away sees Haman. He's afraid. He's coming here with horses. He thinks maybe they're going to try to attack. He tries to get the children out. Run away quickly before they hurt you. And the children say, no, we're not leaving. They remain with Mordechai. And afterwards, Mordechai is asking, what are you doing here? What do you just teach the children? In the Beit Midrash, what kind of Torah lesson do you give them? And he says, well, I've been talking to them about the Omer sacrifice. And that kmitzah, that small amount of Omer sacrifice that was offered, it was waved, again, is offered as the meal offering, kind of meal offering, right, of barley. And Haman is very, very upset about this. And he says this is his downfall because he looks at the Omer, that the fact that this Omer, they gave a little bit, what is it worth? A little bit barley sacrifice, which is worth hardly anything. And let's say 10 little shekels, and he's 10,000 shekels weighing to try to kill the Jews, and he realizes that things are going to turn around for him. And it all is based, interesting, the Talmud brings a story of the Omer. This is really what caused Haman to wake up and realize that he's going to fall, the Omer sacrifice. And why? What is so special hinted within the Omer itself? And that really, from here lies the secret of understanding this whole concept. Here we go a step further, and I want to bring down the beautiful words of the Or HaChaim HaKadosh in this week's portion, which will really connect everything together. The Or HaChaim HaKadosh was one of the Chaim Ben Atal, one of the great sages who lived a couple hundred years ago in the 1600s. He says like this. He brings down the verse, and you will count the days of the Omer. And he says, Omro lachem. Why does it say you will count? Usvaltem lachem, you will count for yourselves. And he says, Litzad sheyitzav Hashem lispor sheva Shabbatot. God commanded us to count 7 weeks. And our rabbis teach us, he brings down the Zohar Kadosh. Why do we have to count these 7 weeks for? And he says, Litzad shayu betumat Mitzrayim v'ratzah Hashem nizdaveg le'umazo. Because they were in the uncleanliness of Egypt, and God wanted to connect completely with the people of Israel. So therefore, it had to go through a counting period. Just like a woman who's menstruating has to count 7 clean days before she can be with her husband. So the people of Israel, we have to be with represented by the Knesset Yisrael, like the bride. We have to get married to God. And the Sinai was like a chuppah, like a wedding canopy. And therefore we have to go through the 7 days of purifying ourselves. Right? The 7 days of purifying ourselves for receiving Torah weren't exactly 7 days. Each day was a week. 7 weeks. And why is it needed longer time, he says? And he says we needed a longer time because of the terrible uncleanliness we had upon ourselves from Egypt, which means we were all involved and encompassed by uncleanliness in Egypt, where the people of Israel were worshiping idols. And they needed this period of 7 days, which were really 7 weeks, right? Like a woman who's cleansing herself from uncleanliness, we have to cleanse ourselves from the uncleanliness of idol worship. And really it took the 7 weeks until we were finally ready to receive Torah. And that's what he goes on to say. And this interesting concept of cleansing for 7 weeks is something, in reality, that it was like a proof to show that within our souls, within the depth of our souls, really, we only had room for only Hashem. No other additions besides God. Only one Hashem in the world. We spoke about this. The last lesson I gave was about the lamb. And we spoke about how that proved that they were able to sacrifice that idol worship of Egypt and throw that lamb away for only Hashem, for God. And exactly what the whole concept here of counting the 7 days, the 7 weeks, and slowly shedding off the idol worship, which was only external, because on the inner side, our hearts and souls were so connected to Hashem, realizing there's only one Hashem in the world. And this is the great concept where Or HaChaim is teaching us, that we have to count those days. This is very, very interesting. And the fact that we're reading about this week's portion, about the sacrifices that are brought by counting the Omer. So right after the Omer sacrifice, which was barley, was brought, it mentions to bring 1 kevis, 1 lamb. And then afterwards, it's mentioned at the holiday of Shavuot, after counting 7 weeks, we're bringing 7. So why in the beginning only 1 lamb brought, and afterwards 7 lambs brought? And the answer is is that the 7 represents the cleansing ourselves. Once the first lamb represents that whole, brings us back to the beginning of Passover. We bought that lamb and we slaughtered the idol worship of Egypt and got rid of that. And then afterwards, the 7 reflects the 7 weeks of cleaning ourselves, the 7 weeks, till finally we could receive Torah, which was like the light of a sapphire stone. That's what it says, that the 2 luchot, the 2 beautiful tablets of stone, were like, they were the souls of Israel, lighting the world up like a sapphire stone, which is mentioned before. And this concept of cleansing gets even deeper, because we know that the Omer sacrifice wasn't the clean wheat, like the white wheat. We want to have, of course, whole wheat. I'm saying it wasn't wheat, which is a food for a human being. We know that barley is really an animal kind of food. It's used for animals, and therefore, why do we have to bring barley to Hashem if this is our way of cleansing ourselves from idol worship? Why do we have to bring barley? And the answer is, this brings us back to the law of a sotah. A sotah, a woman who has suspicions, her husband has suspicions, God forbid, that she's cheated on her husband, that she was alone with a man. So God brings a test for them in order to prove that she's what's it called, loyal to a husband. And then she's blessed with a child. The same thing here, bringing this, the same thing here with Israel, bringing this barley offering proves that we are cleansing ourselves from idol worship, and that God is now going to give us the Torah, that it was only an external thing and it wasn't an internal thing. And that's the whole lesson, of course, of the holiday from Passover to Shavuot, showing how people of Israel will receive Torah, will be married to God, and a special relationship with Hashem, and shows that in the inside we are all pure for our love of Hashem, and no one else can get in between that love, and there's no one else but God. And that's the great lesson of the Sfiat Omer, cleansing the evil forces in the world that try to hide the love of Hashem and the light of Hashem from the world. And Israel has to bring that light to the world through Torah study and through the beautiful weeks now as we climb and cleanse ourselves. We will rise these great heights and study Torah and bring Torah to the world. Shabbat Shalom, B'sorot Tovot, Yeshuot V'Nechama.